This case is Thermaltake's The Tower 500. I reviewed the Tower 100. In fact, KitGuru got a world exclusive on that. It was a mini ITX chassis, looks approximately like this but much smaller, and it was of interest. I never reviewed the Tower 900, which is an absolutely enormous vending machine sized case. I saw it at Computex a few times. I'm quite glad I didn't see that because it would be up here. Huge, great thing. This Tower 500 sits between those two models, just as the name suggests, and in terms of pricing, the Tower 100, £100, Tower 500, £200, Tower 900, £300. All makes perfect sense. To confuse the issue very slightly, there's this Accessory LCD panel, which is £90. So as a proportion of the cost of this £200 case, that's quite a lot. This review, I think you will find interesting. The Tower cases have the motherboard in this plane, which means the graphics card hangs vertically, and the rear I/O is on the top. This panel pops loose quite easily, and there you can see loads of stuff. To remove these panels, we first pop that loose, and now you can see the front I/O in all its glory, and the side panels simply lift up. You'll see mesh and glass. Take the panel, flip it over, and you can reverse it. So the position of the glass and the mesh can be flipped. What is that by eye? 40%, 60%? And the front panel, which is just glass and lightly tinted. Your first thought might be this is a huge open space, but where on earth do you mount fans, radiators, all-in-one coolers? Very good question. You get this pair of brackets in the accessory pack, engage this screw in that grommet, and the same over here. Screws at the top, and now you have a radiator or fan rack. And it's the same deal around this side. To my mind, this is reminiscent of meccano, which is a series of nuts, bolts and brackets that you'd assemble into a toy, a structure. Until we get into the build, we won't know how much we like that or dislike that. But that explains how Thermaltake can get away with this huge open space. Go around the back. 2 thumb screws. Away with this cover, which is filtered and has a large intake area. And you can see 2 fans, loads of storage mounting points, and the power supply housing. Those storage points can accommodate up to 8 2.5-inch SSDs or 8 3.5-inch hard drives. If you want to install storage on these panels here, it's kind of a power supply cover, but there's actually a great deal below these plates. So let's just pull those out. Like that. Drive goes on. Screws from the underside, clearly a 3.5-inch drive or 2 SSDs, no great difficulty. Grommet's already installed and you get a bunch more in the accessory pack should you require. And the same goes on over here. Exactly the same. Go to the bottom of the case, we've got a filter below the power supply, single thumb screw. Off with that cover, magnetic dust filter. Same on the other side. You'll notice there's a good deal of symmetry going on here. Also filtered. And then we come to this front cover. You can see that the Accessory LCD goes into place nice and easily. With all that hardware removed, we have something slightly interesting going on. So that bracket there is a mount for 2 fans, which would breathe in through there. However, we can move this bracket. We can actually flip this bracket, which is why we have a screw hole there to secure it, corresponding on the other side. Let's just run one screw into place. And now if you choose, you can install a rad in the floor of the case, a 240. So the permutations for storage and cooling entirely depend on whether you want to put just a 360 AAO or custom loop rad in one side or t'other. This would probably be the better location away from the motherboard and the graphics card. Whether you want to use the floor mounts at all or just put a couple of fans in the front. If you're putting the LCD in there, clearly you've got the issue about putting cooling directly behind it, so the LCD would pretty much preclude that. You can put fans up in the roof, you get 2 fans in the back, but of course if we were to put 8 storage drives in it, it would transform the picture. The other thing is this nut plate in the floor of the case, which has a whole series of female threads. Those are intended for Thermaltake pump mounts. So if you're using a pump reservoir standing here, obviously with a custom loop, then again, that means you're, by definition, removing this plate, which affects your choices. Stripped down, you can see that the bare chassis, it's a framework, and then you decide on your build and you work from there. I think the smart move here is to put a power supply, motherboard and graphics card in the chassis, and that's going to take us halfway towards a final build. The power supply housing is retained with a thumb screw. If you choose to give yourself more clearance, you can loosen these 2 thumb screws and remove this entire assembly with the 2 fans, storage brackets, and so on. And that means that we've now got heaps of access. Power supply is this 850 watt platinum rated Thermaltake ToughPower PF1 ARGB. You want the intake at the bottom. Motherboard is this Asus Tough Gaming B660 Plus Wi-Fi D4. D4, it means it supports DDR4 because I happen to have this kit of Thermaltake ToughRAM RGB in racing green on the shelf. DDR4 16GB, rated at 3600 mega transfers. Processor Core i9-12900K, already inserted, and a Sabrent Rocket 4.0 SSD. On with the heatsink. And ready for installation. Big, isn't it? Still, as we get the cooling system in, it's going to fill up. Graphics card, Sapphire Radeon RX 6800 XT. Really don't like having a graphics card almost hanging in free space. If I wasn't doing this in video, I would definitely have the case laid down at this point. That's looking more like it. The final part of the build is this Thermaltake Toughliquid Ultra 360 AIO, which I'm going to put on this side of the case. Floor panels installed, side brackets installed, cooler, fans, the whole bang shoot is in place. I now need to attach the pump block to the CPU, which is actually quite a close fit between the RAD and the graphics card. So I'm going to take my own advice and lay the case down before I apply thermal paste and do the business. It's not exactly heavy, but it's certainly big. Arctic MX4. The configuration of the finished PC is unusual because the components are rotated 90 degrees. This necessarily means the rear I/O is under this top cover, which is slightly tricky to access. In fairness to Thermaltake, they've allowed for this, so you get a lot of USB ports on the front panel. 1 Type-C, 4 Type-A's. Does your motherboard have 2 of those long USB 3 internal headers and 1 Type-C? This Asus does not, so 2 of those USB ports are not connected. I followed my usual form with thermal testing, so the Core i9-12900K and RX 6800 XT graphics were stressed with simultaneous runs of Cinebench R23 and TimeSpy stress test. The system was pulling 545 or 550 watts at the wall socket, which is quite a stiff test. I did 3 runs with different fan configurations. In each case, the case fan's running flat out, which is 1200 RPM. In the first instance, the AIO fans on the cooler were also running at 1200 RPM, and it sounded like this. Then I ramped the AIO fans up to 1500 RPM, leaving the case fans flat out at 1200. Sounded like this. And finally, I turned the AIO fans to full, which is 2500 RPM, and it sounded like this. Thermal results. Bit of a mixed bag here. With the fans running low and slow at 1200 RPM, the system nice and quiet, the processor was quite hot at 94 package temperature. Graphics 70. Increasing the speed of the AIO fans to 1500 RPM, we saw a drop of 4 degrees, so the CPU was 90 and the GPU 69. Turning the AIO fans all the way up, we see a CPU temperature of 86 and the GPU temperature of 68. I don't find those thermals particularly impressive, and yet the funny thing is that CPU cooler has been reviewed by Luke quite recently, and he liked the cooler a great deal. So I don't think the cooler is the issue here. In fairness, Luke reviewed it on AM4, and this is a LGA 1700 Core i9, but nonetheless, coolers be coolers. So I think the issue here is the airflow in this case is just peculiar. Look at the orientation of the CPU cooler, look at the location of the graphics card. Imagine the air is coming in from the roof, in from the floor, in from this side which doesn't have any fans, it's being expelled over that side, and the exhaust is really hot. I think the airflow could do us some assistance, or alternatively of course, don't put a huge great amount of hardware inside the Tower 500, and the 12900K is a stiff test for any PC. So I'm leaning towards the view that this case is interesting and quirky, but it's not about maximum thermal efficiency. So what do I think of the Thermaltake The Tower 500? And I'm not even going to dwell on the fact that the name The Tower 500 is a bit unusual. I got used to it with The Tower 100. Pros, the good points. The Tower 500 is unusual, so kudos to Thermaltake. We like unusual, and the thing is, if you don't like the look of this case, you'll have known it 10-15 minutes ago. So if you're interested, then quirky and unusual is a good thing. The price is reasonable, £200 for the case. You've got the LCD screen as well, but that's a separate issue. However, I think you're going to have to factor in other fans. You could put 2 fans in the roof, you could put 2 fans in the floor. So £200, but you're going to be spending more than that, but that's always true. Cons, the negative points. The case takes up a large amount of desk space. I mean, just look at it. You only get 1 set of fan radiator brackets. I think it would make perfect sense to have a second set of brackets so you could put fans in the other side or in both sides of the case simultaneously, whether you have them in intake or exhaust. more airflow would be a good thing. And the optional LCD screen is fun, but it's expensive. So you can report your CPU temperature down the bottom or put a little logo on there. Well, fair enough, but how much money do you want to spend on that? Overall, it's okay. I'm awarding Thermaltake an extra half point just for the unusual nature of the Tower 500, and that makes it an 8 and worth buying.